What's up, guys? Evolutionary.org podcast coming away, episode 422. Today, Rick's going to do an interview with Rick Collins. Stevesmi here.
Hey, what's up? What's up, Steve? What's up, guys? How's everybody doing out there? Hey, we fumbled the intro on this one, huh? After hundreds of episodes, we fumbled an intro. Yeah, guys. So I do a podcast where I interview people in the industry that have information that is important to you guys. It's the Elite Fitness Podcast. You guys can go to elitefitness.com, and on the top right, there'll be a link that says podcast. And in this one, I'm interviewing Mr. Rick Collins. He is the steroid lawyer in the U.S. Guy has been around steroid laws, enforcement, legislature since the early 90s when steroids became illegal, all the way until now, working with companies, individuals that have issues with problems with SARMs and research and steroids and pro hormones. He is very knowledgeable. It's a nice long interview. You guys are really going to enjoy. So this is on the Elite Fitness Podcast. That's a different feed, but we're going to syndicate the whole show here for you guys. It's about an hour and change, hour and a half interview. Really good, interesting interview for anybody that's has any kind of doing anything in this industry. It's definitely a very, very interesting interview. So ready to listen to it, Steve?
Yeah, let's see it, man. I'm excited to listen.
All right. So here we go. Without further ado, here's Mr. Rick Collins. So I think everybody's really wanting to know what's going to happen with these SARMs, with these not for human consumption research items, and even some SARMs being sold in capsules now. What's going to be the future on that, and how long that's going to keep going on for? What's going to happen? Because if they get scheduled, these pharmaceutical companies haven't made their money on them. I mean, what do you think? What is your opinion on?
So well, first of all, thanks for having me, Rick, on the podcast. I appreciate it. I've been doing this stuff for a long time. You bring up research chemicals and sort of these things that are sold not for human consumption over the internet. And I've probably handled more of these cases where the government has gone after people or companies that do it than as far as I know, any other lawyer. So, and this goes back. So what the future is, we'll look at what the past is, right? So it's been about 20 years that this market has existed, not for SARMs. It started out with other types of ancillaries for bodybuilders that were being sold for research purposes. And SARMs are just kind of the latest chemicals that are being sold for that purpose. But the government doesn't like it, right? Big pharma doesn't like it. And the government and Department of Justice don't like it. And the FDA doesn't like it. And so they have gone after
head shops too. They're head shops too that sell not, for research only items that are for people to get high or have lucid dreams and crap like that. That's
exactly.
That's also.
Yeah, exactly. If you remember a while back, you remember Tommy Chong, Cheech and Chong?
Yes, I remember them. Yeah,
those comedians. They, the whole bit was just they were weed heads and they were just getting high all the time. And they made a bunch of movies about smoking marijuana and having a good time. And after they made those movies, and that was really what both of them, Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong, were known for. So Tommy Chong decided to start selling bongs, right, over the internet.
Pirates. Yep.
So he set up this website to sell bongs, and he said on the website not to be used for smoking weed. And so even though he was selling bongs and he had pictures of him, looking high, and his entire reputation was based on smoking weed, he would say not for smoking weed. And the government went after him under the idea that this was fraud and that he was in fact selling paraphernalia for the purposes of smoking weed, even though he said he wasn't. And so just saying something is for one thing and not another is not necessarily the end of the story if there are circumstances or facts that suggest that it's just bull, right? So him saying not for use with marijuana when there was really no other legitimate reason you could even come up with for why people would be going to Chong's Bongs and buying bongs. He was prosecuted and he was in fact convicted of trafficking in drug paraphernalia. So that sort of, calling something one thing and it actually being shown to be something else under the circumstances is the same theory that the government uses to go after people selling SARMs, peptides, erectile dysfunction drugs, anti-estrogens, anything that typically people in the fitness or bodybuilding community are using sort of as adjunctive kind of things to steroids. Any of that, if you're selling it not for human consumption, but the circumstances show, well, it's obviously for human consumption, that's a problem, and that's something the government goes after.
Now, do you think that at least we already know research, Novadex and Clomid, some of this stuff is probably not going to become highly like race and scheduling. Do you think that that's going to happen with SARMs? Will they be scheduled the same as steroids? Will, GW Cardarine and Ostrin and some of these products be categorized same under the law as testosterone and Dianabol at some point? Or what do you think?
So first, we could have a long discussion someday about how it is that testosterone wound up in the Controlled Substances Act, in the same law with heroin and cocaine and marijuana and oxycodone. How did testosterone get there? And it happened in 1990 that Congress put it in there. And we could talk about the hearings that preceded it and why Congress appears to have taken that action, and whether, in fact, it was the right thing to do. Not many people realize that in those hearings before testosterone became an anabolic steroid, the DEA, the FDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the American Medical Association all sent representatives to Congress to testify against scheduling testosterone and other anabolic steroids as controlled substances. No, few people seem to remember that from 30 years ago, including folks in the DEA and the FDA. But that was their position at the time, and we could definitely talk about whether that was the right thing to do, because Congress obviously disregarded all of their testimony and instead listened to some folks who were in organized sport who were complaining about cheating in sports. So that happened in 1990. And, when Congress is presented with what they think is a potential sports cheating scandal, this is sort of their go-to, right? They take it and they make it a controlled substance. So there have been some highly publicized cases of elite level athletes testing positive for Ostarine and other SARMs. And obviously anti-doping authorities are upset about that and are looking to try to keep these substances out of drug tested sports. And so, similar to what happened in the ramp up to the 1990 Anabolic Steroid Control Act, some folks in Congress started looking at whether we should make SARMs into Schedule III drugs, just like steroids, under the theory that they have similar or somewhat analogous anabolic properties, and that athletes are abusing them and using them to build muscle or enhance performance in a way that organized sports people and anti-doping people think is unfair. And so I think it was probably 4 years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, two senators, Orrin Hatch and Sheldon Whitehouse, introduced a bill that would make SARMs into the same level Schedule 3 drugs, similar to testosterone and anabolic steroids, which would effectively make it illegal to sell SARMs unless it was pursuant to a prescription. And of course, a lot of these things are not approved as FDA drugs. But it would also make it illegal to possess them. And that's different from today, Rick, because right now, the laws that we talked about before of like sort of fraud and selling something as a research chemical when it's obviously not for research, it's for people to use, whether it's to get high or to get jacked, it's for people to use. That you can go after the seller, the marketer, and I've represented a lot of people who market peptides and SARMs who call me up and say the government has just conducted a search warrant. They've just called me and let me know that they're investigating me, or they've just questioned me for selling, for marketing, for introducing those substances into interstate commerce, which is what makes it a federal crime. But if this law were to pass, this SARMs Control Act were to pass, then somebody who bought SARMs, somebody who's possessing a bottle of Ostarine in their car or their house, if that were to be recovered by law enforcement, that would be a crime under federal law and could be prosecuted, and that guy could get a conviction and potentially jail time just for possessing a SARM.
Yeah, definitely. I always thought that one of the reasons steroids it was easy for them to be classified, become illegal in 1990. I think the big sports scandal was Ben Johnson and Carl Lewis. Ben Johnson beating Carl Lewis, testing positive for Winstrol at the time of the Olympics. And I think most of those drugs were already past their patent protection time. And
Right.
So the pharmaceutical companies couldn't quite protect them. And they wanted to also launch new drugs to take their place in some of these diseases that were being prescribed for. And I think because it makes it a lot harder, it makes it a lot different for a doctor to prescribe something once it's in that category than when it's in the same level as as an anti-estrogen, Nolvadex or something dumb like that. And but the pharmaceutical companies haven't quite made their money on the SARMs yet. Maybe I got my tinfoil hat on a little bit, but I think I've always thought that
Just because
you're
paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you, as the old saying says, right?
I mean, I've seen so many weird things happen, like NAC becoming now you can't have it in your supplements anymore. I have a supplement that I have NAC. I had to the new version, can't have it anymore. When I see some of these things, I think like there's more at work. Now SARMs are not illegal yet. Have you seen anyone do jail time over SARMs or peptides or research?
I have seen people do jail time over SARMs and peptides. Not huge amounts of jail, and the facts are always dependent on individual circumstances in a case, and the ultimate result has a lot of factors that go into it. I have seen, and I'd never breach an attorney-client privilege, so this is just knowledge you could get from just looking at the public dockets and whatnot, and my clients typically don't go to jail, and I fight like crazy to avoid that happening. But there have been cases where in other situations and with other lawyers and even with facts that are unpleasant. So obviously, whether somebody gets jail time or not depends on a lot of factors. It depends how much money they made in a fraud case, how much drugs they moved in a drug case, whether they have priors. So if somebody's already done 5 years, let's say, for trafficking in drugs, and now gets involved in, selling peptides or SARMs under circumstances where it's clear that they could be proven that these things were not for research purposes, that they were for human consumption, and that the guy selling them absolutely positively knew it and that was his intent, then there can be jail time on those cases. It's not the same amount of jail time as would go into a heroin or a cocaine case or something like that, but prior criminal history plays a big factor, and what the facts are, how much evidence there is that calling it research chemicals and saying, having a disclaimer that the buyer needs to click on saying, I'm a researcher, I'm not going to use this, how clear and obvious it is that that's just BS.
Have you seen in any cases people being affected? Like, I have a podcast, we talk about antibiotics. I've had people on who talk about the steroids and stuff like that. Has anyone been in trouble for just having the First Amendment right to talk about these compounds and even advise people on how to use them? There are a lot of very popular YouTubers that have, some of them, millions of followers, millions of views, that are just talking about how to use stuff, everybody, Dave Palumbo, more plates, more dates, Tony Hughes. I mean, all these guys are on social discussing in pretty close detail the usage of these things, answering questions from people. Have you seen anyone be affected by it?
So the First Amendment gives a lot of protection. People are allowed to talk about things, and that's not criminal. And it's very hard for the government to prosecute people for simply saying things, unless there's something a little bit more involved than that. So if you look at it on a spectrum, on the one end, it's, somebody, let's say, just saying, here's the sort of stack that I've used in the past, and that's just FYI for information. There's no way the government could prosecute somebody for telling the truth about what they've used in the past. At the other end of the extreme is somebody who's either selling steroids themselves or saying, here's what I've used and here's how you can get it, and having a link to somebody, an underground lab or something like that, or directing people to it. Obviously, if you're facilitating the possession or purchase or sale of controlled substances, well, then it's a whole different thing, right? Then you're in the potential criminal harm's way. So a lot of the conduct is somewhere in between, right? And there's a spectrum where, it's more than just, here's what I've used in the past, and I don't necessarily condone it, but this is just FYI what I've done, to the other extreme. And, where the line lies between those two, where the scale tips from protected speech into potential criminal conduct, either conspiratorial conduct, where arguably you're facilitating or aiding or agreeing with the seller to sell it, is really very fact dependent. So a lot of people sort of operate in that gray area, hoping that they're on one side of that equation, that they don't tip over, and recognizing that these are sort of tougher cases to prove for the government than simply going after the underground lab guy himself, right? Somebody who's much easier, low-hanging fruit. And so with limited resources and limited manpower or staffing, the government typically goes after the easier cases. And so people play the odds that even if they go over the line, chances are the government won't go after them. And if they do go after them, well, then they'll call Rick Collins and he'll be able to, work his magic on it. So that becomes, I think, the thinking for a lot of people.
You've been defending these kind of cases now for going on what, about 25 years now? My
Pretty
mistaken?
close, man. That's scary. It's scary, you know.
It's been a
Consider
long time.
I'm only
Yeah.
35 years old. How could that be?
So, because I remember your book Legal Muscle, came out around 2002, 2003.
2002. Yep. Yep. And I'd worked on that
Now,
for a couple of years. Yeah. So I've been doing it for
has
a
there
while
been
before that.
I remember we worked with your affiliate program for that book back in the day. Now, do you have an updated version of Legal Muscle out there yet?
So I don't know if people read books the way they used to, you know.
Audiobooks, man. You got to have Amazon and Audible. And
maybe that would make sense. Maybe that would. I mean, obviously, since 2002, a lot has changed, right? I mean, the laws have changed. You know, that the 1990 steroid law was in place then. That was changed in 2004, and then in 2014, you had the Designer Anabolic Steroid Control Act that now exists. The U.S. Federal sentencing guidelines have changed dramatically back then to be a lot tougher on the same quantities of steroids that the same amount that would have been possessed or trafficked in, you know, prior to 2006, when the guidelines changed, was completely revised and much more harshly treated after that. So and the literature has evolved too, you know, and the market has evolved. If you look, and you know this, back in the 80s and you know early 90s, before the Control Act really started having its effect, the steroid products were typically diverted U.S. FDA approved pharmaceuticals, right? Getting backdoored, right, out of friendly pharmacists.
Guys would argue between which was better, human grade or vet grade. If you the lower level stuff, you would just get veterinarian grade from Mexico. It was still, you know, ran by an approved lab, but that was the argument back in the day. Now everything is underground. Yeah.
Right. So, you know, so what's happened is, well, for a while, it sort of, you were getting finished products coming in from overseas. And then as the imports started getting, you know, more and more of a crackdown on them, then finally now what you just have is raw powders from China coming in and you know, underground lab chemists esterifying it in their homes and slapping a label and selling it as an underground lab product. So the market has changed a lot. Back in the, you know, before I wrote the book, you were starting to see some clinics, TRT type prescribing going on, but now you've got even clinics that are franchised, focusing on men's health and wellness and using testosterone and other, even sometimes other types of peptides to treat people in aging men, to make them feel better. So the market's changed a lot. At some point, I could see another book or some sort of audio book or something along those lines. But I kind of been covering it in my magazine column. I do a column for Muscular Development magazine, and I've been doing that since just about when I wrote the book, actually before I wrote the book. So if people want to see like what's the latest thing going on, Muscular Development, either the print copy or musculardevelopment.com has a lot of my archived columns on it. And I've covered everything from the SARMs Control Act to FDA related changes, dietary supplement issues, just general health and wellness policies, and kind of what bodybuilders and people in the fitness community should know about what's going on with laws, policies, and even like cultural and social developments. So that's one way of finding out. And I'm also active. I do a lot of these podcasts, and I'm active on social media. Anybody who wants to follow me can follow me on Instagram at Rick Collins ESQ. You can follow me on Facebook at Rick Collins Online. And so those, and I'm on Twitter too at Rick Collins ESQ. So I try to
Which
keep
is your
people up
stronger?
to
Which
date.
is your strongest outlet? You know, everybody's got social has a really strong outlet. Where would you say your strongest at? IG or Twitter or Facebook?
Yeah, you know what? I'm finding that Instagram is a good way. I get more people, more eyes on stuff through Instagram, even though it's more visual based and less content based. And I'll put in my bio, I'll put links. If you go to my Instagram account and you go to the bio and the link tree there, you'll see a whole bunch of links to podcasts, to articles. I just wrote an article, actually. I co-authored a piece, and I've written a number of peer-reviewed journal pieces. And I just wrote a piece that is something that's fascinated me for a long time. And it's the difference between the way we treat gender dysphoria and muscle dysmorphia. And muscle dysmorphia is like bigorexia, right? The guy who on a mental illness standpoint, right? I mean, and that, look, there are bodybuilders who have that, right? I mean, that no matter how big you get, you still look in the mirror and you think you weigh 110 pounds soaking wet with change in your pockets, right? And at some point, that's a indicative of a mental disorder, right? I mean, it's one thing to say, yeah, I still have to get bigger, I need more size on my chest or arms, but it's another thing when it reaches a level where it's actually a disorder. And gender dysphoria is also categorized as a mental disorder, and it's the idea that somebody who has one gender that they were born in it feels that that's the wrong gender, and they're imprisoned in a body that doesn't match their self-perception of who they are. And obviously, if you're a female at birth and you self-identify as male, then the law allows you to be prescribed testosterone in order to change your body to match your self-perception, right? Because you're treating that disorder. With bigorexia, if you go to the doctor and you say, I'm 140 pounds, but I self-identify as 240, and I would like testosterone to try to match my self-perception to what I see in the mirror, that doctor's going to throw you out of his office, and you're going to be sent to a shrink to try to make you accept the way you look. And the article is provocative because, and I'm not saying that in any way that trans or non-binary people should be denied testosterone. I think you should be happy in your body, and if there's a scientific approach to allow it, great. I'm fully supportive of that. And we're not even saying that people who want to get bigger should be prescribed testosterone. What we are saying is that the gap between those two treatments, so that one is looked at favorably and almost celebrated in modern society, and the other sends the doctor to prison and and makes it a crime for a person to possess it for those reasons. That's a pretty far gulf. And I'm not sure anybody's really looked at how wide that distance between those two approaches is.
It's sad, but even just having this conversation in some mediums would get us canceled. Just even bringing up these questions and even talking about them. One thing I will say is this: I had this conversation, actually, believe it or not, a good almost 10, 15 years ago, before everything that's going on around was going on, because it's always been easier for transgender people to get prescriptions for hormones than it's been for bodybuilders. And I remember having this conversation with somebody I respect, a gay gentleman, and his answer was, well, Rick, they fought for those rights, And I think it kind of boils down to us bodybuilders. We kind of hide our views. We're kind of shy about it. We're embarrassed by it. But I think it wouldn't take much for us to turn this whole thing around and be able to be prescribed that. We just got to come out of the woodwork, stop fucking hiding.
Yeah,
and come out and say, this is what we want. pot users are now having their day. So it's no longer illegal to possess pot, but it's
Right.
illegal to possess Diana. I mean, that's crazy. Now, anybody who's who's transgender, feels they're born in the wrong body, they're able to get hormones. Obviously, well, they fought for those rights hard, but we hide. And I don't know. I mean, besides me doing a podcast, having conversations with gentlemen like you, and just getting the information out there, I mean, what else could we do? Because I mean, it really is that simple, dude. I think it's just it's not even, it doesn't have to be a big movement. We just got to come out and say, look, we want to just enhance, we want to have rights to enhance, but we hide it from our own families. I think steroid use is probably more in the closet than a lot of gay folks out there. I mean, on social, there's a lot of fake naturals on social. There's a lot of guys that won't admit to their own use. I see a lot of fucking jack dudes in suits, and not everybody talks about their cycle and what they're doing. So I think that's got a lot to do with it.
Yeah, it's funny. Certainly the pro marijuana lobby, and it may be just that there's probably maybe more people who smoke pot than are doing gear, and so it picked up more steam. There's also sort of an anti, there is, and we cover this in that article. There is sort of an anti-testosterone kind of aspect to modern society, right? I mean, the words like testosterone poisoning are acceptable, and like hyper masculinity and masculinity in general is not looked at the way it was 40 years ago, when icons were John Wayne and be tough and be hard. That those sorts of ideas have evolved and gone away, and we live in a society now that is much more empathetic and more interested in emotions and feelings, and has sort of, I co-wrote a piece with a friend of mine a number of years ago called Estrogen Nation. And so, I think the movement, the zeitgeist, as they say, of modern America, and maybe even in other countries too, is sort of a softening of the what is acceptable and what is looked at as favorable conduct, behavior, and such. And so testosterone and steroids are on the the wrong side of that cultural evolution.
For sure. Even as a marketer, trying to get ads ran on Facebook, it's easy to get your ad ran for anything weed related, pot related, dispensaries, training programs to participate in the industry, CBD supplements, all that. Now you try to have an advertising approved with abs in it, or some dude flexing, or things like that, or even bottles of supplements. It's anything to do with fitness, musculature, becoming bigger, portraying the ideal body. I think it used to be a cause for an ad rejection on Facebook, even just social media, and they control so much of the flow of information. They're all against it. I mean, they're for pot big time, but they're all against anything to do with fat burning, with muscle, with gaining muscle.
Well, look at the whole success of a franchised gym like Planet Fitness, right? I mean, the whole success of that franchise is based on an anti-bodybuilding campaign. Their whole campaign is that bodybuilders are uneducated, stupid, terrible people. And the most famous ad is the guy who walks around in the Planet Fitness saying, I pick things up, I put them down. And the Planet Fitness trainer walks him around the gym and says, I have a spot for you, opens the door, and of course puts him back into the alley behind the place and slams the door on him. And the idea that you can't deadlift in a Planet Fitness, you can't spot somebody or make a lot of noise in training, or have a gallon water jug with you, is, when they pride themselves on the idea of no judgment, or being a judgment-free zone. Apparently it's no judgment against people who are completely out of shape or obese, but complete judgment against anybody who is in great shape. And that's worked for them, right?
Yeah, man. This world is kind of losing me. The models are now overweight. There's nothing to aspire to. The models are overweight. The new Batman, this kid who's going to play Batman, he refused to work out for the role. Matter of fact, he went about the press about it. He says, I don't want to be set a bad president and keep asking me to get in shape. Like I'm an Avenger. I'm not that. Yeah, man. It's definitely a different world, man. You let somebody borrow the car now, they don't bring it back with a full tank. You know,
yeah.
people
well, you know, it's like, you know, look, there's a happy medium, right? I mean, nobody should ever be shamed about their body, you know, and you know, I think in some ways, where we've gone is good for some people. I mean, certainly if you're, you know, if you have some medical problem, or if you're just overweight, and you know, people should not be made to feel bad about themselves. But on the other hand, you know, we should also inspire people to improve. I mean, all of us can. There's not one of us who can improve in some way. And if the message is simply accept yourself exactly as you are and don't try to improve in any way, physically or in other ways, we're sort of like celebrating mediocrity, and I'm not sure that's really where we want to go. The other thing I just wanted to say, just because you were bringing it up about weed, before I forget it, is that you may have been following, and this is another big development, you may have been following what's gone on in Oregon. So in Oregon, they actually, very progressive state, they actually changed their law, and they have decriminalized the possession of all drugs in Oregon in small amounts, so that if you're in possession of a small amount of heroin, or you're in possession of weed, or you know, whatever it is, it's no longer a crime in the state of Oregon. And that was done, I think, in, you know, looking at maybe social equity and social justice issues. But I mean, the funny thing about it is, because they made all controlled substances decriminalized, guess what got swept up into the decriminalization? Anabolic steroids, right?
Juice.
So
the juice.
I'm sure that wasn't in their minds when they did it. And maybe had they thought about it, they might have tried to carve them out, because it, you know, I think it sort of contrary to the way their worldview might be. But yeah, so bodybuilders in Oregon,
federal laws still apply to. The federal laws still fall over all these little.
The federal law still applies in every state, right? And so, and that's why even in states, for example, where they've legalized marijuana, that doesn't mean that it's legal for under the federal law. The federal law still makes it. Marijuana is still a Schedule I drug. You know, even cocaine is Schedule II. Steroids are Schedule III. Marijuana is Schedule I, which means there is no accepted medical use for marijuana. Even though I think anybody with, you know, who can do a simple Google search would see that, you know, there is support for the idea that marijuana can have medical uses under the right circumstances for people. So yes, federal law still applies, although the feds and the DEA typically never go after personal users. It just wouldn't be worth their while to go after some guy with a vial of Trenbolone in his kitchen. So in Oregon, you know, when state law changes, at least for personal use, small amount matters, it really has a pretty dispositive effect on, you know, personal use situations.
Is a pill of Dianabol still considered like a pill of ecstasy under the law, under the sentencing guidelines that changed in the 2000s, or is that been reeled back? Because somebody listening to this might think in Oregon they could walk around with their bottle of D-bol in their pocket, and no, that's 100 capsules,
Yeah,
tablets, whatever. You're
so,
going to jail, bro. Like, you have 100 ecstasies.
Right. So state law defines, and different states can define different amounts. Some states will make personal use and misdemeanor situations based on circumstances of the possession. Others have a set number of pills or units that they use. But under federal law, you're right. In 2006, the guidelines were changed. And up until then, it's interesting because prior to the change in the guidelines in 2006, you had 50 tablets was 1 unit of steroids, and 10 cc's was 1 unit. So basically, if you had a 10 milliliter vial of stipionate, that was 1 unit. If you had 10 vials, that was 10 units. If you had, 100 D-balls, that was 2 units. So in order to get up into jail, prison exposure, you needed a damn boatload of steroids, right? So, and that was true in the earlier part of, this century. I was actually part of the working group that was brought to
I remember reading that article. Yep.
Yeah, so I testified
to help figure out
behalf.
how much are guys really using.
Yeah,
I remember
was
you
part
had
of all
clients
that.
get into situations that were doing heavy cycles, and
Right.
they would get pegged with these crazy charges of distributing. Well, no, this is like what this dude does in a month.
Right. Yep. And it's
I
because
remember
that's
reading
so
that
different.
article.
Yeah. And even the patterns of use are so different from what the DEA and the government is used to, right? I mean, if you're a crackhead, what's your
Every day they
purchasing?
buy a little bit every day. That's
Right.
what
You go out, you get high, you come off it, you go back out, you get some more crack, you come back, you smoke it, and then you go out and you look for more crack. So you're never in possession. The only people in possession of huge amounts of crack, or even moderately large amounts, are people who are selling it. But obviously, you and I both know that steroid users are pack rats, right? I mean, you're going to acquire everything you need for your contest prep, for your full cycle. And so you're going to have a whole bunch of different drugs, and you're going to have enough of them. And so a guy who's just a, mid-level NPC competitor might have what the feds would look at as, the Pablo Escobar of steroids. So I did testify about that, right? And but the guidelines changed, and so now 1 tablet is 1 unit. So it matches Vicodin and other Schedule 3 drugs. So 1 tab of D-ball or Anavar or Anadrol, doesn't matter whether it's a 5 milligram tablet or a 50 milligram pill, it's 1 unit, and half of a cc is 1 unit. So now that vial, that 10 cc vial of DECA is now, instead of it being 1 unit, it's now 20 units. And so the more you have, the more the units.
Let me just steer the conversation a little bit towards this, because you mentioned that is real interesting. There's been a surge in TRT clinics over the last decade, where they're just everywhere now. Now, I know a little bit about it, a little bit about how they're being franchised out now, how even some of the laws that changed around the pandemic, around COVID lockdowns, where you could have telemed, where you could see your doctor basically through Zoom. And some doctors could even get a special license into just on the next state over. So now if you have 15, 20 doctors around the country, and each of them get the licensing to do a telemed in adjacent states, you pretty much have a lockdown. And you can create a whole network of TRT clinics and prescriptions and stuff. This is what I've been kind of following, because it's really interesting to me how they all came out, and now they're all over Facebook. They're marketing to me on social. So you talk a little bit more about that. Is that going to continue to go on, or do you think that's going to also come to an end? Because I see them prescribing now stuff that I know has not been approved for human use yet. Some of these peptides are not approved, but they're prescribing them. And how's that work? And what are your thoughts on all that?
So, the TRT clinics have evolved over time. If you remember, probably 15 years ago, there were some efforts by law enforcement folks to try to crack down, and they were looking at some of them as kind of pill mills, the equivalent of like a pain pill mill, where you just call up, you speak to a sales rep, and next thing you know, you've got some DECA and tests showing up at your door. What makes TRT clinics or any prescriber or distributor, medical distributor of anabolic steroids into the harm's way area of criminal law is when it's for a non-medical purpose, right? There's nothing wrong with prescribing testosterone for a medical purpose, with a valid prescription for legitimate medical use. But it's not okay to prescribe it for non-medical purposes. And non-medical purposes include bodybuilding or putting another inch on your chest or your arms, right? Or increasing your bench press. So anything that shows that that's what it's for is subjecting that clinic or that doctor to potential harm's way. And I think the clinics have changed a lot of their modus operandi and how they operate, to try to adhere to the medical side of things. So they are requiring blood tests. I don't know how you could prescribe testosterone to somebody without knowing what their levels are, right? So the first thing that they'll do is that they'll often have some type of video conference between the patient and the doctor. They'll look at factors that suggest that it might be for non-medical purposes. Is the person an athlete? Is the guy 21 years old? What sort of dosing? There were times where some of these clinics in the early stage were giving, 800 milligrams of test a week to a 23-year-old who was competing in sports, so that's how you get yourself jammed up, right? But certainly the science has evolved, and the science suggests, particularly for guys of a certain age, I don't know, 40, late 30s, late 40s, certainly 50s and 60s, that as your levels drop, and naturally, which is just that natural, hypogonadism, over time, that testosterone can be very beneficial for a whole lot of quality of life aspects, for those who have low levels, and that it's not the big threat to the heart, particularly at TRT doses, that some folks claimed it was, and that the FDA put a black box warning on testosterone saying it can cause strokes and heart attacks. That science doesn't really support that. And as you probably know, there's a bunch of class action lawsuits that have been filed against the makers of testosterone drugs, creams and stuff like that, claiming that, hey, you were false advertising and you were saying that this is good for people, but it's not, and it causes heart attacks, and my client had a heart attack and stuff like that. And the reality is, every month I see a new study coming out that supports that testosterone is actually good for your heart if you have low levels and you're of a certain age and you don't have any contraindications, that testosterone can actually improve cardiac health. And so it's interesting. I think as that has happened more and more, and of course the devil's in the details, right? The difference between a medicine and a poison is the dose. Taking 150 milligrams, 180 milligrams a week of testosterone might be good for somebody's heart. Taking 1,500 milligrams of test, DECA, and trenbolone, for long periods of time, that's not going to be good for your heart. So assuming that the TRT is done in a safe manner, and again, I'm not a doctor, but certainly what I read in the medical literature suggests that the risks that have been portrayed in the media and by these plaintiffs' class action lawyers are really not, they're baseless.
You know, the TRT clinics, yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot. I remember there was a time where a clinic got raided and they pulled out the records, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was like 50 Cent and Mary J. Blige and a lot of
Right.
actors
Yep.
and stuff were on their patients list, and all this crazy
Yes.
stuff was going on.
Yeah, some people.
That was yeah, but there were a lot of famous folks were swept up in that. And now fast forward to today, and now today apparently you can go to a TRT clinic with your testosterone levels through the roof and just tell your doctor, hey, I've been injecting this stuff underground. I'm not going to inject it anymore. My levels are going to crash. Can you prescribe me something to give me a soft landing so I don't go into depression? And apparently just how maybe a heroin addict can get a drug to help them not go into a withdrawal. Apparently now some doctors of these TRT clinics are willing to work with you. And as long as, subsequent blood tests show that your levels have dropped to a normal and you're not still abusing it, they'll prescribe you to come down, and you never have to really provide a low testosterone test. You just have to, level with the doctor and say, yeah, my levels are crazy, but that's because I was injecting illegally. Now I just want to go through you. How much can you give me per week, and give me a soft land? And I mean, that whole game has changed a lot. Apparently, from what I've heard, the people behind it who are franchising all these clinics out, the guys who have the doctors networks, they also have people up in Washington trying to help change some things to make it so that they can survive long term. Because I mean, dude, they're prescribing TB 500 to people. They're prescribing things that are, now you can get Anavar, you can get a Deca of Vandrolone through these clinics. I've even heard that they're going to be prescribing Dianabol soon again, which were all at some point approved for human use. But it's been pretty interesting how that's changed. And I was just wondering if you had some recent experience with TRT clinics and some of those things.
So who knows what the future is going to hold? It seems like, things develop for a while, and then somebody in government or in a medical regulatory context will look at it. I have represented doctors in the past who've gotten jammed up for their practices in, prescribing testosterone or other steroids to patients in a medical licensing situation, not even criminal. So obviously a doctor who is prescribing a lot of testosterone and other steroids can get on the radar screen in a number of different ways. Certainly the type of advertising can put the person on the radar screen, or a complaint to the medical licensing folks from a family member or from a disgruntled patient. And then they start looking into it. And then ultimately they ask for the doctor's records. And then they see the doctor is prescribing testosterone and Anavar to, let's say, a woman who is a competitive bodybuilder or something, or to a 21-year-old who didn't have low levels. And suddenly, some of these medical licensing boards are comprised of very conservative folks, and so you'll have an endocrinologist sitting on the board and asking the doctor questions like, well, you're not an endocrinologist. You're a emergency care doctor. That's what your training is, or you're a dermatologist, or a plastic surgeon. What made you think that you would be able to practice endocrinology? And there's definitely a divide between the mindset of the doctors who are involved in these age management kind of clinics and the more traditional, orthodox, conservative endocrinology folks who are like, if your levels are not equivalent to a 90-year-old woman, then we can't give you a drop of test, and that's, unfortunately, that is somewhat of the mindset of the more conservative endocrinologists. So there's definitely a divide there. Whether at some point there's another another one of those operations like the one that went after the clinic that you were talking about, or some other clinics in Florida over the years. It may be, as things get more and more and more aggressive, that somebody makes a complaint and that puts some clinic on the radar screen.
That's very interesting. Yeah, there are definitely a ton of them out now. And it's changed the game because they don't have to go get their own doctors. They plug into this network of doctors and they're done pretty much. They just have to go out and find patients. And it's a real interesting landscape. It'll be interesting to see if this comes to an end as well. Because you've been at this for 20 something years. I've been at it for about just under 20. And we've seen so many things come and go, man. Just so many different things come and go within this industry, within the I guess you could call it the enhancement industry.
Yep. But Rick, I love what I do. I am so happy. I was a competitive bodybuilder when I was young, and I was a personal trainer, and I'm certified strength and conditioning specialist through NSCA. So fitness and health and nutrition and training has been part of my life since long before I was a lawyer. And I love that I've been able to kind of, my practice is kind of where these two things meet, right? Where health and fitness and wellness and nutrition intersect with criminal and regulatory law. I've gotten to meet I've represented a lot of pro bodybuilders. I've gotten to spend a day in Arnold Schwarzenegger's office talking with him and meet him a number of times in my capacity involved with pro division of IFBB as counsel. I've had all sorts of fun stuff, and I love being able to help people who get jammed up. The criminal cases that I handle as a defense lawyer generally don't involve anybody hurting somebody else. I'm one of the few criminal defense lawyers in the world whose clients typically don't steal anything, don't hurt physically, they're not, or sexually, or even economically. They don't do those sorts of things. It's basically people who are involved in a community who are looking for a certain type of appearance, and are using steroids or selling steroids within that kind of context. And many of my clients have no prior criminal history. They're law-abiding people. They're good people who get jammed up because of the way the laws are. And as you probably know, the U.S. laws on steroids are not necessarily the same as once you get out of the U.S. In the United Kingdom and in Canada,
different other places.
That's right. They don't treat it the same way. So, here we are much more militant and harsh on the way we deal with these, particularly in the context of possession. It's night and day. So I love what I do. I love helping people. I love that a lot of my clients on criminal cases, become my friends on social media. And will chime in and recommend me to other people, and they want to be part of my journey as things go forward, and I love that. I'm very blessed, Rick. I'm very lucky to have the practice I have, and certainly anybody who needs me, or who I can help in some way, if you're in the nutrition or the supplement industry, or if you're get jammed up by law enforcement. And we could do another show sometime, Rick, and talk more about people's rights and what to do if you're questioned by law enforcement, or if they show up with a warrant or they don't have a warrant and they're looking for consent in one context or another. There's so much information that we could give to people. But I really appreciate you giving me the time to chat today. It's been a lot of fun. You're very well versed, and you and I, have been watching this for a long time. I love that you brought up Ben Johnson. I'll finish with this. That 1988 Seoul Olympics sports scandal where Ben Johnson beat Carl Lewis really launched, in many ways, the war on steroids by the U.S. Congress, and in some ways really launched my career in defending people who were accused of these crimes because of the law that went into effect because of Ben Johnson. And so I got the chance to meet Ben Johnson about 5 years ago. We were part of a panel together talking about doping in sports and steroids and stuff. And he and I were able to have a private conversation where, I acknowledged to him, I said, I owe my career in many ways to the fallout that occurred from your doping scandal. And we took some pictures together. And I think that picture is somewhere on my Rick Collins ESQ Instagram page, as well as other stuff. So anybody who's interested, certainly you can follow me there. And, if anybody ever has a question or a problem, I'm here to help.
Not to get too political, but it was Joe Biden that spearheaded the whole move to make steroids criminalized. He
was certainly part of it, and very vocal in the putting out the idea that steroids are un-American because they foster cheating, and of course the reality, and we could talk about this another time, but the reality is that the vast majority of people who are using anabolic steroids for non-medical purposes are not even competing in sports. It has nothing to do with sports. It has nothing to do with performance in a contest or competition. The vast majority of people, and the vast majority of people using steroids are just looking to appear more muscular than they would without them. That's it, and I've analogized this, and I'm sure you've read my pieces and heard me talk about that. I think for all of those people, steroids are much more akin to cosmetic surgery. It's the male, typically the male version of liposuction and breast implants. It's subjecting yourself to medical risks arguably for vanity. Okay, but we're a very vain culture. We do all sorts of stuff for vanity that's allowed. But I think the context is much more similar. And yet, while a lot of those things are perfectly legal to do, if a doctor does that, or you go to a doctor trying to do that, you're thrown out, or the doctor gets arrested. So it's an interesting, discrepancy.
Yeah, the majority of steroid users are Bob, just going to the office every day doing an accountant, looking brolic, just looking huge.
I did it. I was part of a study on that. We did a survey a few years back. You may remember. I think it was published in the medical literature in 2007, called "A League of Their Own," and you can go on. You can find it online by Googling, and the average steroid users in their early 30s, using it for cosmetic purposes, not competing in sports, hasn't competed in sports in years and years and years, has above average education, has above average income, and it's purely for non-medical purposes, to look better.
Yeah, absolutely. Professional, just Bob going to office, professional, making good money. Yeah, that's
and yet he's a criminal.
The average steroid user.
And yet that Bob is a criminal under American law.
We need to get all the Bobs out of the woodwork. It won't take long. It'll be a couple of months again. I will say this, Rick. I in my 20 years in this industry, I've sold advertising space. I've now made my own products. Deal with manufacturers. Deal with a lot of people. I think we have something like 300 friends on Facebook that we are in common. Sure. Everybody looks for Rick whenever they're jammed up with anything. All these nutritional supplement companies. There was just this guy I was just talking to about making a pre-workout for me. Back in the day, many years ago, he had done some pro-hormone deals after the bans. And, years and years later, it caught up with him, and he had to go and, deal with his past. And he mentioned having you as an advisor to his lawyer. So if people aren't hiring you directly, they're hiring you to work with their lawyers,
yes.
And advise them. It's definitely I mean, I've yet to see anybody in the industry that gets jammed up that doesn't call you or have their lawyers call you, because you specialize in this thing. Now, let me ask you this last question before we go, and we could get into a podcast about this too. When you were going to law school, when you were thinking about becoming a lawyer, what did you actually want to specialize in? Because I doubt you were in law school thinking about defending steroid users, right?
Right.
What were you thinking about doing with your life? When you grew up, what do you want to be?
It's it's so funny because when I went to law school, it was before steroids were criminalized. They weren't even controlled substances, so there was no even thought that could ever be an area of practice. And it was really before sports nutrition really took off. It was only in the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, and in the aftermath of that people started coming out with sports nutrition products. I remember when I was in college, there was sports nutrition didn't really exist. There was some desiccated liver tablets that we were taking, and this chalky, horrible protein products, or there was this like collagen, this like red syrupy collagen in a plastic bottle that you'd pour on a tablespoon and drink, and it tasted like something between motor oil and cough medicine. And so so I had no idea.
Stories.
Right, you remember it was a long time ago, but that's what it was. And so timing is everything, Rick. It's funny that the year that I went into private practice in 1990 was the same exact year that steroids were criminalized by Congress. And so maybe things happen for a reason. And so the timing was just perfect. When I went to law school, I was initially thinking about being a prosecutor. And so I did work for 5 years as a prosecutor. So I was putting the bad guys, and it was putting the bad guys in jail and fighting for justice, and putting away the robbers and the rapists and the people who are doing terrible things to other people. And I loved that job, and I think I did it in a way that was fair. I was tough but fair, and then I went into I left that to go into private practice because I'm entrepreneurial like you, and I wanted to build a business. I wanted to build something of my own with my partners, and I started out doing bread and butter criminal defense, and I still do some bread and butter criminal defense work at the federal level outside of this this practice. For example, I'm representing one of the people who went into the U.S. Capitol on January 6th and defending him on that case in Washington. So I do other cases as well, and I love being a criminal defense lawyer. But I this sort of came about because I was, having been a competitive bodybuilder, having been in the gym culture for years, when steroids became criminalized, and suddenly in the early 90s people started getting arrested for steroids. It was like, what the hell is going on here? And nobody really
They made it harder for you to get your stash. They made it harder for you to get your stuff.
Oh, you're a bad man. So so I started getting calls, and these were the kind of guys that had been spotting me in the gym for years. These are the same kind of guys who were my friends. And so it was great. And my practice evolved naturally, organically. It wasn't something that I planned. It wasn't something that, was opportunistic or thought out. It was just, sometimes, fate finds you, and you find your place, and you find your purpose and your mission in life. I was just talking to some law students the other day, and talking about, a lot of young people are looking for happiness within the legal profession. And I say, looking for happiness is not, you're never going to find it. It becomes, it's like chasing a ghost. The closer you get to it, the more it evaporates. And, instead of looking for happiness, search for purpose. Find your purpose. Find purpose in what you do, and happiness will follow finding that purpose.
I know there had to be a time where you defended those one or two really well-known key clients that kind of established you, settled you in as like the go-to guy? Because we, our industry, it's in a way everybody kind of knows each other.
Right.
And I know that had to be a time where like you defended those one or two guys that are really well known, and after that, everybody started calling you. Is that how it kind of went about?
Yeah, I think that kind of happened. Even guys who weren't overly well known started, singing my praises to other people because of how I handled their cases and how I kind of understood things that other lawyers didn't. But yeah, I represented the chemist in the Balco case probably 20 years ago, and that got a lot of publicity. The whole cheating scandal with Marion Jones and Barry Bonds and all of that. So that put me on the radar screen, and I represented Dave Palumbo. You brought his name up before, but Dave also sings. Dave always says, if you don't hire Rick, you're out of your mind, and I appreciate that tremendously. And so I represented some people who were higher profile and who had some influence in the community. And so I think that definitely put me on the radar screen. And really, there's not a lot of other lawyers, if any, that really have the experience and knowledge of decades in the trenches. And so, yeah, I think, like you said, if you're in this business and you're involved with any kind of FDA or DEA problematic substances, you probably know who I am or have me on speed dial.
Yeah, for sure. Nobody wants to sit with their lawyers and have to explain to them what these steroids are. I got in trouble with, right? Nobody wants to do that.
And I wind up doing that. When people hire me as a consultant, I wind up doing that. I wind up educating their lawyer from a very rudimentary level.
Yes, I could. That's why they either hire you directly or they bring you in to work with their lawyers, because some of these guys might be great criminal lawyers, but they don't know the difference between a Deca and a D-ball and a Anavar. They don't know anything.
And that can be the most important thing, And so I've handled cases in all over the country where people will bring me in as the lead lawyer, and then I'll bring in just a local guy who, and I'm very, very careful about who I bring in as my local counsel, because I want somebody who is the right fit for the particular prosecutor involved and the particular judge that the case is going to be in front of. And so I can kind of very much handpick local counsel. I've worked with excellent local counsel around the country, but a lot of the heavy lifting I can do because a lot of the negotiating involves the particular expertise that I have. And that benefits the client. And that combination I've found on cases from the deep south to the far west and everywhere in between is great. And I am licensed in numerous states as well. I'm licensed not only in New York but in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and DC and Texas, but I found that particularly in very small jurisdictions, small cities, having local counsel that I bring in is a great way of getting sort of the combination of the knowledge and experience and the subject matter with a little bit of home cooking, where the judge will see a face that she recognizes or he recognizes, and that combination gets the kind of results that then have people going out and spreading the word about me. Yeah,
I like reading a lot of your stuff that you put on social and some of your columns. I really like reading your stuff because it's always very interesting, because in this industry, you always see people, even people like I said, my buddy has a brand on the up and up, and some pro hormones he sold 4 or 5 years ago caught up with him. So you always see people jammed up that you consider just normally good people. And some of the better ones that I like reading when you write is this whole steroid thing is so complex that even prosecutors don't understand it too well. And there's times that you've had to go and explain to the prosecutor what it is we're doing here and why maybe your case is not as strong as you think. You know, it's always been interesting that even the prosecutors don't even understand it.
That's very often, and you know, and I've dealt with. I got to say, most of the prosecutors I've dealt with are smart people, and you know, they're worthy adversaries, and I like the look. You know, it's if you want to be a trial lawyer, you've got to be a gladiator. You've got to recognize that when you're a defense lawyer, you're stepping into an arena, and the government, for all the, you know, mechanisms of presumption of innocence and burden of proof on the prosecution, the reality is the government has great resources. They've got tremendous resources. They've got tremendous advantages, and you're the gunslinger. You're the guy who's coming in, you know, guns a-blazing to try to dig your client out of what could be just a deep, deep black hole. And I take it seriously. I say that the greatest compliment anybody can ever pay me is to trust me as their lawyer, to hire me as their lawyer, because, you know, that puts a huge burden on me. You know, you're entrusting me to save your life very often. And so whether it's through negotiation, and you know, explaining to the prosecutor how certain presumptions that he or she has about the case are unfounded, or certain guideline views that they have are actually not correct. And I have enough experience to be able to articulate these things in a way that's persuasive. And you know, and if you have to fight and you have to litigate, which I have, you know, I've litigated all sorts of weird issues and weird cases across the country. You got to be prepared to fight. And but yeah, very often I'm able to work things out in a way that is very beneficial to the client. And I'm probably one of the few lawyers who can say that the majority of my clients don't go to prison, even on federal cases. And that's statistically very, very unusual, if not unprecedented. And obviously you can never make guarantees, and every case is different, and, you know, circumstances vary. But I can tell you that the majority of my clients are prosecuted in federal courts and don't go to prison. And I'm proud of that.
I think the fact you just understand every side of this so well puts you at a huge advantage. Like we were just discussing, it puts you just an incredible advantage of negotiating when you're the one explaining to the prosecutor what we're doing here, what we're talking about here, what these things are that we're talking about. And I think it's great, because otherwise you'd have two lawyers that don't even know what's going on, don't know what they're even looking at.
Yeah, and I've seen that happen sometimes, sadly, where people will call me and they'll tell me what happened with their case, and, you know, it's too late for me to help. And it's you know, I'm like, well,
one of the reasons I know one of the reasons I know it's a mess out there is because, at least when we read some articles, even sometimes you share on social, where people are getting having to forfeit money for SARMs or this or that. The agencies that are coming after them are always different. Sometimes it's the FDA, sometimes it's the FBI, sometimes it's local. So the fact that it's so kind of widespread, different agencies are enforcing it. Each different agencies are using different laws to go after these guys.
Yeah, you could add Homeland Security. You can add Homeland Security to that. You can add the postal inspectors to that. Yeah, oh, absolutely.
The fact that it's not just one agency or two using the same laws, but basically several agencies using everything in the book to try to put these guys out of business. It definitely takes someone who really knows every end of it to really negotiate and get you out of this jam with a decent result, for sure.
Yeah, and I'm humbled and I'm blessed to be able to help people in that way. I really love what I do. You know, it gets back to, you know, purpose leads to happiness, and I thank you for giving me the chance to chat a little bit. I hope anybody listening to this podcast got something of value out of it, and follow me on social media, and certainly you can reach out if you go to rickcollins.com. rickcollins.com is a website that has some information about the sort of federal practice that I have. And if you're interested in supplements and sports nutrition issues, we do represent, my firm represents a lot of companies. We even do trademark work. So if you're looking to, even contract or trademark work, I have lawyers that do an enormous amount of that work and can help supplement companies to navigate those waters. So yeah, maybe I'll see some of your listeners on social media, reach out, say hi. I go to a lot of the trade shows too, at least until COVID kind of derailed so much, but I usually go to the Olympia, I go to the Arnold, and some of the expos for supplements. So maybe say hello if you're there.
Yeah, Rick, thank you very much for coming on today. I'll definitely try to get another interview with you. I get into kratom. I want to get more into steroid laws and international things to do with steroids. And there's definitely a lot of other topics.
Absolutely. Growth hormone we could talk about, individual rights and how to protect them. So much we could talk about. So thank you again, Rick. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you for your time today, Rick. I know you're a busy guy. I appreciate it. And we'll be in touch via social and try to get something going. I'm going to link your socials, basically your Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook on the description of this podcast so that people can go and join you and read.
Awesome.
You post in very interesting stuff. I like reading all of your work, man. It's incredible. Thank you very much for your time today, brother.
You're welcome, man. Thank you. Take care.
All right, guys. Yeah, that was a great interview, Rick. You guys really got into the legality of SARMs and steroids and talking about TRT clinics and stuff. So, this guy, seems to be working with these companies and advising them and stuff. So is this guy a guy that someone could get in contact with if they need law help?
Oh, yeah. Rick Collins. I mean, a quick YouTube Google search will find you, Rick Collins.
So he's a pretty he's a nice guy down to earth, huh? Not a typical asshole lawyer, huh?
Well, Rick, he's a New Yorker, so he's got to be a good guy, right? I've been familiar with Rick now for almost 2 decades. Just his work. I've never had to personally use him. Thank God. Hope I never will. Knock on wood. So definitely a really good contact. So any of you guys out there need any help, anybody in the industry, out of the industry, just anything, man. Rick Collins, quick Google search, you'll be able to find them. I'll make sure to link in the show notes, a link out to his social or his website, so you guys can go check him out and talk to him if you have any problems or anything you need.
All right. So this is number 422. Rick Collins, a very unique podcast for sure. Great job on it, Rick. We'll talk to you guys next week with another one.
Have a good one, Steve. Have a good one, guys.
Guys, this is the required legal disclaimer. We are only sharing our experience from years of steroid use. We are not doctors, and none of what we say should be regarded as medical advice. Always check with your doctor before taking any drugs or starting any training program.